Hello everyone, and welcome. My name is Jeff Mitchell. I work here at Rhodes Scholar, and it is my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture, much like an April day, The Life of Mary Todd Lincoln. Today, you will be hearing from Dr. Samuel Wheeler. Dr. Wheeler is the 10th state historian in Illinois history. He specializes in the history of the Prairie State, Civil War era, and the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. He serves as the Director of Research at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois, where he oversees historical content development in the museum, as well as the library's oral history program, the Papers of Abraham Lincoln documentary editing project, and the annual conference on Illinois history. So, without further ado, let's have a warm virtual welcome for Dr. Samuel Wheeler.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in today. This is my second Rhodes Scholar virtual lecture, and the first one was a lot of fun. I expect this one to be fun, too. I want to thank Lincoln Land Community College in Springfield, Illinois, for being a good partner with Rhodes Scholar. Through that collaboration over the years, we've brought scores of groups to Springfield, Illinois to immerse themselves in the land of Lincoln, Lincoln's adopted hometown. And we've gotten to welcome thousands of folks to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, where I work every day. Educating folks about Illinois history as well as the life and times of Abraham Lincoln. Thanks again for tuning in today. Today we've got a great topic. We get to talk about one of my favorite characters in American history, and that is Mary Todd Lincoln. If you read a book about Mary Todd Lincoln, or if you read a biography about her husband, chances are it will portray Mary Lincoln as either a villain or as a hero. The way historians portray her varies wildly amongst historians. It seems like they either love her or they hate her. Some of these historians really demonize Mary. They make her a real villain. These folks portray her as dishonest, mean in many cases, and they pick up on a strand of historiography coming from way back into Mrs. Lincoln's contemporaries, William Herndon, who proclaimed that Mary Lincoln made her husband's life a domestic hell. Wow, what a portrayal. On the other end of the spectrum, Mary Lincoln also has a group of defenders, folks who have tried to explain away her faults. Sometimes they've denied or even minimized evidence that could make Mary look bad. Now, my approach with you today is to say that either or approach, that villain or hero dichotomy is not very useful for us today as historians. Both approaches obscure the real Mary Lincoln. As historians, I think it's our job to do our best to understand her as a person, because once we take the time to really get to know her, I think we can then ask deeper questions, like what does her life tell us about life for a woman in the 19th century? What does her life tell us about the horrible experience of Civil War? And ultimately, what does her life tell us? What secrets does it reveal about Abraham Lincoln, arguably the greatest president in American history? So let's take some time to get to know Mary Lincoln. The Todd family originally came from Scotland. Mary's grandfather was one of the founding fathers of Lexington, Kentucky. Lexington became known as the Athens of the West. It had a brief period where it was a tremendously happening town in America, for sure. His seventh child was Robert Smith Todd. That was Mary's father. He was an educated individual. He had been to college. He was a businessman. He had invested in a cotton manufacturing company that made fabric from that. He was also a slave owner. He was a politician. He was an active member of the Whig Party in Lexington, Kentucky. For 20 years, he served as the clerk of the Kentucky State House. He later became a state senator from Kentucky. In that role that Robert Todd occupied in Lexington, the Todd home became an epicenter for politicians. Prominent Whig politicians, not just in Kentucky, but prominent individuals that had a reputation on a national scale. It was common for Henry Clay, for instance, the most prominent Whig in America, to be at a dinner party at the Todd home. From a young age, Mary Todd understood that politicians were prominent people who commanded respect. Mary's mother was a woman named Eliza Parker Todd. She died while giving birth for the 7th time. When she died, she was only 31 years old. Mary Todd was 6 years old when she lost her mother. Mary Todd was born on December 13th, 1818. She's born 2 months after Abraham Lincoln lost his mother in southern Indiana. Mary Todd was born 10 days after Illinois became a state. A little bit of context. And Mary was the 4th of 6 children that survived from Robert Smith Todd's first marriage. Now, Mary, like a lot of stories, Mary has, in many ways, the textbook evil stepmother, if Mary was to tell you the story. Her father, very quickly after he lost his first wife, began courting Betsy Humphreys, who came from a very prominent family, again, in Lexington, Kentucky. He gets remarried to Betsy. They go on to have 9 more children. So think about this. Mary Todd, little girl in Lexington, Kentucky, is one of Robert Smith Todd's 16 children, 14 of which lived to adulthood. In a household like that, it's hard to get your father's attention. You're one of more than a dozen children. But also, Mary's father is gone a lot on business, and he is also preoccupied with politics. Mary didn't get along with her stepmom. And so looking back on her childhood, this breaks my heart, but Mary Todd called her childhood desolate. She said that her childhood home was more like a boarding school. And we don't know exactly what she means by that. A boarding school meaning that she felt like her home was a boarding school. You could imagine being one of more than a dozen children feeling like a boarding school. Or she could have also meant that she really grew up in a boarding school. Believe it or not, Mary was sent away to live in in boarding school about 1.5 miles away from her house. Again, she's not getting along with her parents very well. She couldn't find her way in this house. In terms of Mary's personality, there's a great quote that one of Mary's cousins uses to describe young Mary. She says, Mary was, quote, very highly strung, nervous, impulsive, excitable, having an emotional temperament, much like an April day, running all over with laughter one moment, the next crying as though her heart would break. I think that's a wonderful insight. Mary, as a young girl, is a very bright individual. She's desperately seeking attention, though. That's a common hallmark in her early life. She received a tremendous education. We talked about her being in a boarding school just a mile and a half away from where her father and her stepmother lived. For many reasons, keeping Mary in that boarding school probably makes the Todd household function just a little bit better. She's not tangling with her stepmother as well as her step siblings, who she didn't really have a great relationship with. As a result, Mary had about 10 to 12 years of formal education. That's extraordinary for a girl in the 19th century. Every community that Mary would live in for the rest of her life, she was amongst the most educated people in that community. One of the passions of young Mary Todd's life was politics. She grew up in a politically aware household. We talked about her father hosting prominent politicians. Mary grew up loving politics. She became immersed in the political culture of the day. That's incredibly unique. Politics was a man's business in the 19th century. Mary, from a young age, began reading those partisan newspapers. Her sisters described her as a violent little Whig. She chose the same political party as her father. And she liked to talk politics with her dad as well as these prominent politicians. She's craving attention. Being a political animal is how she gets some of that attention from her father. She tells her sisters at a young age that her goal in life is to become, to live in the White House. She's going to be married to the President of the United States someday. Now, her sisters tell that story for the rest of their life. They talk about Mary being the most ambitious person, the most ambitious woman that they'd ever met. An ambitious little girl saying she's going to be married to the President of the United States. Now, certainly today, our ambitious little girls that we're raising, they say they're going to become President of the United States. Mary, in her era, ambition looked a little bit different, but they all commented on it. So when Mary's education was finished, she had grown to adulthood. What were her options in life? Was she going to go back home and live with her stepmother in the Todd home? Was she going to stay in Lexington and try to find a husband? Lexington during that period, the 1830s, it's being surpassed by other towns that are on the river, etc. There's opportunities to be found maybe in other locales. Mary's oldest sister, Elizabeth, offers her a great opportunity. Mary's oldest sibling, Elizabeth, had been like a surrogate mother to her after they lost their mother. Elizabeth married a man named Ninian Edwards. His father had been territorial governor of Illinois. He went on to become a United States Senator from Illinois after it became a state. In 1837, Springfield became the state capital of Illinois, thanks to the work of a small group of legislators that made Springfield the new state capital. Ninian Edwards and his wife Elizabeth moved to Springfield, and they began building a beautiful mansion, as you see on the bottom of the PowerPoint there. That mansion became a important spot in Springfield. When the legislature was in session, that became the place where you wanted to be invited to go to. That was where the parties were. That's where dances were held. Elizabeth Edwards offered her sisters a way out of Lexington. One by one, she began inviting them to Springfield to live at her house, and she played matchmaker with the young doctors and the young merchants and the young lawyers and politicians. She would try to match up her sisters to get them a mate for life, right? And in 1839, Mary moved to Springfield. She's just 20 years old, and she's a catch. She's a catch. Not only is she attractive, she's well-educated, she's flirtatious, she has a sharp wit in conversation, and she's politically connected. She has not just her sister Elizabeth and Ninian there in Springfield, but Mary has a group of close relatives that had moved up from Kentucky and settled in Springfield. She's got her uncle is the physician, but also a registrar at the U.S. Land Office. She's got a cousin who's a up-and-coming lawyer who takes on Abraham Lincoln as his first law partner. Mary has several suitors in Springfield as a young lady. There's rumors that even Stephen A. Douglas, the most prominent Democrat in Illinois, may have been one of her suitors. But if you're thinking like Mary, she can't settle for a Democrat. She needs a good Whig, right, to be married to. So in December 1839, at the American House Hotel, there was in Springfield a ball taking place. This was to celebrate the first session of the legislature in Springfield. Abraham Lincoln was part of the contingent that helped organize this occasion. And according to Mary, towards the end of the evening, Abraham Lincoln walked up to her and told her that he had been watching her all night. And he says, "Miss Todd, I want to dance with you in the worst way." And Mary Todd tells us, and he certainly did. So that's the beginning of this courtship between Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd. Her sister has some recollections about that courtship because it took place largely at the Edwards home. Elizabeth, if you can imagine this, she's spying on the young couple as they're talking. And she talks about Mary and Abraham sitting on the couch, and Mary does all the talking. She's talking a mile a minute, and Abraham is just staring at her. He's just listening. He's not really contributing much to the conversation, but Mary is just talking a mile a minute. Mary is starved for attention. And I think Lincoln had never met a young lady quite like this. She's smart. She's politically interested. She's telling Lincoln stories about Henry Clay. Henry Clay is Abraham Lincoln's political hero. Mary Todd is telling him stories about Henry Clay because she knew Henry Clay. He lived within walking distance of her home in Lexington. That had to be pretty exciting for Lincoln to hear these stories. But Elizabeth, when she's spying on this young couple, she becomes worried that this is not a good match. These two people come from very different worlds. Lincoln is uneducated in a formal sense. He grew up in a log cabin with a dirt floor out in the middle of the wilderness. Mary Todd came from the exact opposite situation. She came from a prominent family. She's very well educated. She speaks French. She throws French into a normal conversation. And you could imagine Lincoln just looking at her being entranced by some of the conversation and confused over some of those French phrases. Elizabeth voices these concerns and says, "I'm not sure this is going to be a great match." Something happens. We don't know exactly what happened. And if any historian out there tells you they know exactly what happened, they're maybe stretching the truth just a bit. But the end result is this couple breaks up. It happened sometimes in 1840, early 1841. And by all accounts, Lincoln is distraught when this occurs. Friends fear that he's suicidal when this happens. Nonetheless, like what happens in a lot of relationships, we go through a breakup and then the young couple reconciles. And Mary and Abraham continue courting in secret. She does not tell her sister Elizabeth that they've reconciled because she already knows Elizabeth's feelings on the matter. Elizabeth is probably trying to set her up with other guys around town, right? Probably encouraging her to get over Mr. Lincoln and find somebody more suitable. And then one day, Mary comes and talks to Elizabeth and says, "I'm getting married." You can imagine that conversation. Elizabeth looks at her and says, "Well, who are you getting married to?" And she says, "It's Lincoln." And so this is a surprise to Elizabeth. And the Lincolns then are married in 1842. They go on to have 4 children. We talked about that in a previous talk. You can learn more about that in my previous Rhodes Scholar talk. Mary does the child rearing in the house. She's an educated person, and all of the kids get educational opportunities, certainly. But what's critical to remember, Mary is raising little gentlemen. She's raising future statesmen. She sews their clothes for them. She makes them look like $1 million as they're walking around town. She makes sure that they have social graces and they're people that have manners and they're commanding respect. Now, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't because they're little boys. And but it's important, I think, to remember that that's how Mary sees these little guys that she's raising, and certainly that's how she views her husband. She is a fountain of ambition. We know that Lincoln is a fountain of ambition. She helps him during his rise as a politician and also as a lawyer in Springfield. The photo that you see here on your screen of Abraham and Mary, that's the earliest picture that they sat for, that we know about. Lincoln had just been elected to Congress, and Mary Lincoln wanted to get her picture taken too. In 1846, Lincoln became a congressman, and Mary became the wife of a congressman. That was a big accomplishment. And then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected President of the United States. There's a famous story that Mr. Lincoln was downtown on election night, and he hears through the telegraph that he has been elected president. He runs home from downtown. He goes to the Lincoln home and he throws open the door and he says, "Mary, we are elected." I think that's a telling comment that he makes. Mary, we are elected. It's not him alone that has accomplished something. Mary has accomplished her prediction. Remember, she is going to become First Lady of the United States. She's going to live in the White House. It didn't take long for Mary to become the most controversial First Lady in American history. Within 6 weeks of Lincoln's inauguration, the Civil War breaks out. And as we discuss in our museum in Springfield, Mary was viewed critically by both the North and the South. Northerners looked at her and said, "This is a woman raised by slaves from Kentucky. She's a Southerner at heart. Is she a spy in the White House?" Southerners looked at Mary and said, "My God, this is a traitor. This is somebody from the South, yet she's married the man who is prosecuting war on us." So Mary's getting it from all sides in the press. They were nasty to Mary. They constantly criticized her fashion sense. Maybe she's too progressive in her fashion, or maybe she's too conservative, right? She's getting it from all different sides, and they write some really nasty things about her. But Mary is also good at getting into trouble on her own. One of the things that sort of drives historians a little bonkers with Mary during the Civil War, she really gets involved with patronage. She convinces her husband to appoint individuals to offices. most of the time he balks at her suggestions, but sometimes he relents. And time and again, it turns out these guys are crooks. These are people who've found their way into the White House, flattered the first lady, and then she begins advocating for them. Maybe they get appointed, and it turns out they're not the greatest characters in the world. Mary also gets wrapped up in a scandal. She overspends a congressional appropriation to refurbish the White House. In the middle of the Civil War, overspending on carpets and wallpapers, you can imagine that makes a salacious story. And then, of course, Mary's temper is famous. It's notorious during the Civil War. There are stories that are repeated and whispered and sometimes even appear in print of a tongue lashing Mary gave a politician or a military general or even her husband in public. Those stories don't go well to ingratiate herself to the press. And then, of course, during the Lincoln presidency, they lose their little boy, Willie. We talked about that last time, but in February of 1862, Willie Lincoln dies of typhoid fever. Mary becomes a spiritualist in the aftermath of Willie's death. She seeks out mediums because the mediums promise her that they can put her in contact with her lost little boys. And then the worst night of Mary's life, of course, was the assassination. As she's holding her husband's hand, he is killed by an assassin. A period of widowhood follows, and Mary's widowhood is it's not a great story. It takes 2.5 years to settle Abraham Lincoln's estate. Though he was a good lawyer, he died without a will. Mary was put on an allowance by the executor until they settled the estate, and it turned out Mary is deeply in debt. She had been buying dresses and jewelry, et cetera, and she has amassed these debts that she's hidden from her husband, and now her son and the executor have to get with her to return some of these purchases, et cetera, and it's a source of terrible embarrassment for Mary. There's also, other things out there. We can get into this during the Q&A if you're curious, but Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon, is at this point writing a biography about Abraham Lincoln. And he gathers some evidence that when Lincoln was a young man in New Salem, he lost a friend that he may have been romantically linked to. He may have even had an idea of marrying her. But according to Herndon, when she died, Lincoln buried his heart in the grave alongside her and never again loved a woman the rest of his life. You can imagine how horrible, in horrible taste that was. Mary Lincoln, his widow, is still very much alive. His children are still very much alive, 2 of them, Robert and Tad. Mary vows the rest of her life to try to discredit Herndon. Robert Lincoln, a young man who had lost his dad when he's 21 years old, he comes to Springfield and confronts William Herndon about the impropriety of forming this interpretation and then sharing it with the world. But Herndon doesn't relent. Mary takes Tad with her in 1868 to Europe. In many ways, Mary goes to exile in Europe. She enrolls Tad in a school in Germany, and she travels the continent, something her and her husband wanted to do after the White House. In 1871, they come back from Europe. They go to Chicago, and Tad is desperately ill. He dies in Chicago, surrounded by his mother and his brother Robert. And in so many ways, that's the last straw for Mary Lincoln. She'd lost her little boy, Eddie, in 1850. She had lost Willie in 1862. She's sitting next to her husband as he's murdered in cold blood. And now she loses Tad. By this point, Robert is married. He's has a family of his own, and Mary, it's kind of the last straw for her. And so we enter this period that becomes known as the insanity period for Mary Lincoln. I hate that term, but it refers to an excruciating decision that Robert has to make in 1875. His mother is in a bad way. She's got body aches, insomnia, anxiety, depression. She's got paranoia, delusions. She's hearing voices. She's in a horrible way. She might be abusing medication. We don't know. She is prescribed opiate-based medication, sedatives. Some of the behavior might be able to be explained away that way. If you read her letters during this period, she is a deeply depressed person. There's passages, and in our collection at the museum, we have letters that there's suicidal thoughts in these letters. That has to be alarming for the people who care about her, most particularly her son, Robert. And so in 1875, he makes this excruciating decision. What do we do in life when someone we love is in desperate need of help? You talk to them about that and they refuse the offers. I'm fine, mind your own business. That's sort of the situation that Robert's in 1875. And he makes this decision after consulting doctors, his mother's sisters, as well as his father's friends. Mary's arrested in Chicago in 1875. She's brought to a courtroom, and a jury of her peers, all white men, judge her insane. And she spends 4 months in a private sanitarium in Batavia, Illinois. She never forgives Robert for this. She fights like the devil to get out of the sanitarium, to get her rights restored. And once that occurs, she flees again to Europe, where she spends almost the rest of her life in southern France. By the time she comes back to Springfield, to Illinois, to live with her sister Elizabeth, she's at the end of her life. She is suffering probably from untreated diabetes. She's nearly blind. Her back hurts her. She can't really stand up straight. And she's horribly depressed. And Mary dies in July 1882. Not a great story. It's a story that is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for Robert. He loved his mother. He wanted to protect her. And it's a story that you sort of just see a continual decline after the assassination. I want to leave you with this, and then let's talk a little bit about what we've said today. One of the most common questions we get at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum, I don't know if it happens every day, but it's every week for sure. Somebody comes up to us on the floor and says, was Lincoln's wife crazy? Now, we don't dismiss that question. The answer we give matters, in my opinion. Understanding her life is critical to how we portray her. And for the last 160 years, people have been passing judgment on her. They've been demonizing, they've been defending her. And in the 20th century, historians and psychologists began working together to try to diagnose her. Most recently, historians and psychologists have reached what I would call a near consensus on what they think Mary Lincoln might have been suffering from during her life. There's no doubt she suffered from depression. At times, she was psychotic. She had delusions and hallucinations. So a clinical diagnosis of major depressive disorder with psychotic features is not out of the question. But there's more. In addition to post-traumatic stress disorder that we would see very readily today in Mary Lincoln, Robert was concerned about her excessive spending. She would go on these shopping sprees where she would buy hundreds of pairs of kid gloves, for instance. Maybe she would buy curtains for houses she doesn't own, and she would sort of hoard all that material. Robert, and this was introduced as evidence at her trial, as evidence that she was clearly insane. Today, we might view those episodes a little bit differently. Those spending sprees might be symptoms of manic behavior. As a young girl, remember, her personality was described as much like an April day. It was sunny and cheerful disposition one minute, and the next stormy and desolate. Is that a 19th century way of describing what we would refer to today as bipolar disorder? That seems to be the diagnosis that most historians and psychologists are settling on these days. So here's the last point. Why is it important to diagnose Mary Lincoln with this bipolar disorder? Historians treat her as a villain or a hero. They demonize or defend her. But by devoting all of our time to those agendas, I think we lose sight of the real person. We obscure Mary Lincoln and her relationship with her husband. But if we diagnose her, then I think we begin to understand that she had an illness. There's no need to demonize anyone with an illness. It's not their fault. Their actions aren't the result of a moral failing. It's not that they're a bad person. There's also no need to defend her by explaining away certain episodes or denying pieces of evidence. I would argue if we accept that Mary Lincoln suffered from an illness that her generation had not figured out exactly how to deal with, we might begin to see her clearly. And by seeing her clearly, what can she tell us about the 19th century? About women in the 19th century, education, courting practices, motherhood, mourning patterns, the religious journey that she was on from Christianity to spiritualism. Mary Todd Lincoln's life can give us a window into the deep sectional differences that ripped apart this country during the Civil War. The Todd family was ripped apart on different sides of this conflict. And Mary's life provides us with insights into mental illness in the 19th century. And I hope by examining that portion of her life, I hope that that can inspire conversations about mental illness in our world in the 21st century. Ultimately, by trying to get to know Mary, not trying to defend or demonize her, but getting to know her, I think we can better understand her husband. Abraham Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln were married for 23 years. Mary Lincoln was the mother of his children. It was someone that he fell in love with and had a great deal in common with. He understood her, and he was aware of her awesome attributes as well as her immense flaws, and he loved her anyway. I want to thank you all for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed participating in these virtual lectures, and I hope to see you in Springfield to learn more about the Lincolns. And I'm happy to take your questions now about the life of Mary Lincoln.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wheeler. That was extremely insightful. To start, Dr. Wheeler, we have some questions from folks who are wondering, what kind of influence did Mary Todd have on the presidency? I know there are a lot of first ladies who kind of have their own initiatives. Did Mary Todd have anything like that, or did she have any kind of influence on Lincoln's positions at all?
Yeah, so she certainly tried to influence a lot of those positions. I hinted a little bit at the patronage appointments. Mary is a political animal, and she does get involved in politics. She has opinions on these things, certain policies, but my God, what she really has opinions about are these different politicians as well as military generals. She is quick to figure out if she loves you or she hates you, and she's happy to tell her husband which side of the fence she's on these guys. He doesn't seem to take much of her advice on that. It's I have no doubt they talked about these individuals and these policies, But Lincoln is making his own mind up for the most part. I will tell you, one of the things that Mary did during the Civil War that was probably a mistake. We think about in the 20th century, 21st century, first ladies having agendas, things that they're very interested in, and causes that they pursue. Mary had those causes. Mary had things that she was interested in, and she didn't do a very good job of publicizing that stuff. She didn't have a whole lot of history to rely on, other first ladies kind of showing her the way. But during the Civil War, for instance, she visited soldiers, wounded soldiers in the hospital. She wrote letters for them. She donated money to various causes to help injured soldiers, as well as the plight of the emancipated slaves. She was interested in that topic. By the end of her life, she becomes by the end of the Civil War, she becomes very much a proponent of emancipation. And, from a PR standpoint, it may have done her some good to bring along a reporter when she was doing these things that are admirable, but she believed those were better done out of the eyesight of reporters.
That's great. Tara just sent in a question asking, did Mary have any assistance in trying to clean up her image while she was in the White House?
Did Mary have any assistance with folks trying to help her clean up her image? Mary had a ton of hangers-on during the White House. People that usually wanted something from her, they would talk to her about things they could do for her. So for instance, if we think about people that would try to help her clean her image up, she overspends the government appropriation by about $7,000 in the first year for refurbishing the White House. She gets in cahoots with the gardener, and the gardener is going to run some of those bills through his account to hide them from folks for accountability. In the end, all those schemes are revealed, and it only digs her hole deeper, right? So was he trying to help her? Well, maybe he was trying to help her, but I think he was looking for favors as well from the First Lady to get different initiatives through. She had a very small handful of people that I think were genuine confidants that had her best of intentions at heart, mostly family, cousins, sisters that are there, that show up in the darkest of times to try to help her out. But my gosh, just a lot of folks along the way that didn't do her a lot of favors either.
And were there, we do have a lot of questions here too. When she went over to Europe, was she staying with family or friends or any of those kind of close confidants that she had when she was staying over there?
Yeah, that's, so no. There's a lot that we do not know about Mary's time in Europe. During the initial trip there, when Tad is in school, she's traveling around. She does meet up with various folks that she knows. Reverend Smith, for instance, that she had known from Springfield. The second time when she's in exile, she seems to have lived on her own in southern France in a place that had a lot of American exiles, travelers, etc. But man, there's a lot that we don't know about that period. I am hopeful that someday somebody is going to send me an email that says that they speak French and they were in some French archive and they're looking at a letter collection from really an obscure person, and they lived next door to Mary Lincoln during that period, and they have all these wonderful stories to share. But as of right now in 2020, I haven't gotten that email.
Well, we can make the pitch now. If anybody has a letter.
Oh, I will love it.
Let me see here. So after the assassination of President Lincoln, it seems that Mary had amassed a large collection of different items and clothing of higher quality. Did she sell off a lot of that after in order to kind of fund her trip over to Europe?
Yeah, so while they're still trying to settle the estate, she returns a lot of those items to try to settle the bills. Before they settle the estate, she comes up with an idea. She's writing prominent politicians. She's writing people that received patronage jobs from her husband. And some of these guys view her letters as a bit of blackmail. She's saying things like, you really benefited from my husband's appointment to such and such a job. Now his widow is destitute and you need to send me some money, or maybe you need to buy some possession I have, etc. Some of those letters end up in the press. It does her no good. And then she settles on an auction in New York where she's going to sell off some of her dresses and jewelry at auction. In the 19th century, this is not a great idea. It gets, initially, this was going to be an anonymous sale, but then it leaks out that this is Mary Lincoln's possessions. You can imagine some of the stories. Really, during the American Civil War, during this horrible hardship and suffering, you were out there buying diamond rings and wearing these ostentatious gowns, and you have all these things, and now you're claiming that you're destitute. It really blows up in her face. And then the estate does get settled. It's a very substantial estate. There's more than $100,000 in the estate when it's settled, divided between her and her sons. She has plenty of money, but she never loses this idea that she's on the brink of financial ruin. That's one of her real fears.
Adam would like to know, did Robert have anything to gain by taking his mother to court? I mean, in other words, could anything other than her health and safety have motivated him?
Yeah, so we talked earlier about, this demonizing or defending Mary Lincoln. And in the 20th century, the mid-20th century, it was very in vogue to demonize Robert. If you were going to defend Mary, right, you've got to have a villain. And so folks attributed a lot of ulterior motives to Robert, such as he was really after his mother's money, or he really wanted a political career for himself and he needed to silence his mother by putting her in a sanitarium so she wouldn't be a source of embarrassment. In my view, none of those ulterior motives hold up. At the AOPLM, in our archive, we have more than 20,000 pieces of correspondence from Robert Lincoln alone. If you go through that correspondence, you begin to see this wasn't a guy with a bunch of ulterior motives. He's not after his mother's money. He does, while she's in the sanitarium, he becomes in charge of her money. And what does he do with that money? He's not out buying fancy cars with it or taking luxurious vacations. He's investing it for her. And when she comes out of the sanitarium in 4 months, she has more money than what she went in with. So check that off the list. The political idea, the last thing in the world Robert Lincoln wants is a political career. He's seen the ugly side of politics, and every day of his life, I don't think that would be an exaggeration, there's somebody in America who is trying to convince him to run for office, because a guy with the last name of Lincoln on the Republican ticket would get elected to anything, including President of the United States. Robert doesn't want anything to do with it. I think at the end of the day, why he took this extraordinary step, it's excruciating. He loves his mom. He's scared. He wants to do right by her. He loves her. He wants to protect her. He wants to see her get well. And it blows up in his face. He'd be the first one to tell you that if he had it all to do over again, maybe he wouldn't have done anything.
And I think we only have time for one more question here, Dr. Wheeler, but I think it's a good one. Kevin had asked, of all the Mary Todd Lincoln items that are kept at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, which do you consider to be the most interesting or sentimentally valuable?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. We have a lot of items that came from Mary. we have a small handful of daguerreotypes that are in little cases. There's one we have of Willie, and it has a locket of his hair. We have one of Abraham with a locket of his hair, and we're told that Mary Lincoln owned those. Those were her personal possessions. Those are, when you open up that case and you look at that, it's a heavy moment. But my favorite items we have of Mary Lincoln are her letters. We have the largest collection of Mary Lincoln letters anywhere in the world. And there's one letter in particular that is, again, I think I would use the word, it's heavy to read it. She writes it after the assassination. She writes it as she's staying in a hotel in Chicago. And she writes it to Robert. This is before the insanity trial. They're still getting along, but she's not getting along with Robert's wife. She's in immense depression. She had lost Tad. And this letter, the only way I can describe it to you is it's a suicide letter. She writes Robert, and she is telling him her final wishes. She describes her funeral. She describes what she wants to be buried in. And she says that she wants to be buried next to her husband. And on the other side of her, she wants to be buried next to Tad. It is a poignant letter, probably written at a very low moment in Mary's life. And man, there were a lot of low moments in her life, particularly, during the widowhood. That letter is very rare because Robert sought out a lot of that stuff and he destroyed it. He did not want his mother's legacy to be tarnished with these letters out there. And she wrote a lot of letters that Robert would have deemed embarrassing and somehow, or showing his mother at her lowest. That one survived. It's in our collection, and I think it's a reminder of some of the depths that she went through.
That's really powerful. Thank you, Dr. Wheeler. So, friends, that's all the time that we have for today. Again, I would like to thank our expert instructor today, Dr. Samuel Wheeler, for his fine work here. A big thank you to all of you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.